Figured I'd elaborate a little bit on the problems that I discussed yesterday with the U.S. trying to act tough with China on Taiwan. Just as a clarification, it's not like I'm a fan of the Chinese government and that I want them to take over Taiwan. Far from it. But I have to be realistic and understand that there's nothing I can do about it. Taiwan is literally halfway around the world. My government cannot stop the Chinese government from conquering that island. Conquests have happened throughout human history. They're usually a bad thing for the people being conquered. But at the end of the day, it's going to happen, as sad as that is. However, since my government seems to be making it clear, as I said yesterday, more and more so, that they are intent on punishing China when this eventually comes to pass, I expressed my grave concern over the ramifications that would have here at home. And I tried to give, sort of microeconomic specific examples, just to illustrate, if I really needed to, how dependent U.S. consumers are on China. So that was yesterday. Today I want to talk more about the domestic political implications and why I said yesterday that I think that this could, bring down the domestic, U.S. administration, the government in Washington. And the interesting thing about that is that I use the same logic that the U.S. uses when it's imposing sanctions on other countries. The theory behind sanctions is that you can make the lives of the citizens of a certain country so miserable as a result of the sanctions that they will rise up against their government, overthrow it, and install a U.S. puppet regime just so that the U.S. will relieve the sanctions. And while that has never really worked in U.S. history, in the history of sanctions, I should say, there is a bit of grain of truth to the logic. There is some good theory there. And I think what is redeemable from this theory is the idea that there is a correlation between economic prosperity and political stability. A population who is fat and happy is not going to be stirred to revolt against their government. But people who are hungry, people who have seen a recent drop in their standards of living, even if they had low standards of living for a very long time, a sudden drop even further in their standard of living creates a great level of discomfort. And that can stir people to revolution. We've seen this time and time again in human history with the French Revolution, with the Arab Spring, with many others. And that is why, the theory of sanctions is sort of rooted in this. They say, okay, well, let's just try and artificially manufacture these conditions which lead to revolution. The problem is that the domestic population understands that these sanctions are being placed on them by the United States and not by their own government. And so it doesn't really motivate them to revolt against their government. They have a proper scapegoat. What happens in these other cases, like the French Revolution or the Arab Spring, is that people already are discontent with their government, and then there is something bad that happens in life, and they blame it in their minds on the government that they already don't like. And so that, famine or just general economic discomfort is what is the spark. It's not the whole motivation. These are countries that already had internal political problems, but that were boiling, bubbling under the surface. But sanctions are unable to spark revolution precisely because they are not able to effectively blame it on their own government. The domestic government is able to blame the United States. But in the case of this matter of China and Taiwan, the sanctions on China would also significantly harm citizens of the United States. This is not like we're talking about the Sudan or Venezuela. This is China, the country that produces all of our cheap stuff that we buy at Walmart. China also produces all of our expensive stuff that we buy at more expensive stores and on Amazon and, in specialty shops. And so, as I think I decently explained yesterday, these sanctions would necessarily mean that the United States would experience a significant drop in living standards because we would have less stuff. Okay? I don't want to go over that again. I don't want to bore people 2 days in a row with the same thing, so I'm not going to get into that. So given that, we then end up in a situation that actually does look very similar to periods in human history which preceded and precipitated organic regime change. We have a country in the United States that has a political disequilibrium, I guess you could say. The structure of society, I've talked about this quite a bit in the past, but not recently, the structure of American society is not congruent to or with the structure of the American government. The structure of the American government is rather centralized and concentrated, not even in the center of the country, but in the northeast of the country. Power and money flow through Washington and then sort of trickle out to the rest of the country. American society, however, is structured much differently. It's far more decentralized culturally. It is more of a salad bowl than a melting pot. In a melting pot, everything sort of mellows out and the flavors blend together. And even if you're eating a piece of onion, that strong onion flavor's kind of gone. It's taken on some of the flavor of the beef and the carrots, and likewise, if you eat a piece of meat, a lot of the beef flavor is drawn out of that. And if you taste the broth, it tastes like everything. But we don't have that in the United States. We never have. And so the more centralized the government becomes, the more the internal differences between Americans become apparent, and the more those differences begin to matter and agitate people. Culture wars occur when you have an over-centralization power. We saw the same thing, around the time of the birth of, the Second German Reich in the 1870s. The dominant Protestant Germans waged a culture war on the Catholic Germans. That's where we get the term culture war. It is from the German Kulturkampf. It was an attempt by the new German state to try and centralize and homogenize German culture, and it was unsuccessful. Even to this day, even though Europeans have largely reverted to a state of being godless animals, there are still Catholics in Bavaria. And likewise, no matter how centralized the American government becomes, there will still be differences amongst Americans, differences which cannot be erased. And so the state, taking it into the abstract now and outside of our current predicament regarding China and the economy, any state that is in a position currently like the U.S. has a choice. Either they can continue down the path of centralization, continue to fight the natural order of their society, and eventually face destruction because it is unable to govern, because it just simply has no regard for, it has no tact. Or it can try and reform itself and try to, be a more effective parasite. Because that's what the state is. The state is a parasite on society, and a parasite cannot kill the host. Parasites, have to just sort of, sit there, suck out some of the blood, but otherwise, not be too much of a hindrance on the host, or else the host is not going to, be productive enough to feed the parasite. So the United States, increasingly over the years, has, and when I say the United States, I mean the government, has been working harder and harder to antagonize its host, its citizens. And so there is obviously a great deal of discontent I think what Congress has like a 12% approval rating. The president has an approval rating in the 30s. The Supreme Court is even losing a lot of its approval. The military, which historically had wide bipartisan support, has slipped quite a bit in the last few years. And so what is left is for the American people to receive that spark, which will ignite their disobedience in order for them to reject the authority of the current government altogether. And I think that spark in the past has come when people feel like they've lost so much that they're desperate and that they don't have a whole lot left to lose. And for most societies, that's when people start to go hungry. It's when they start to starve. It's when food prices become completely unaffordable. But I think that the United States is a much weaker society in that respect. I think that we've grown accustomed to a much higher standard of living relative to our income. And so if that were to slip, even if we were still able to put food in our mouths, but if our wealth greatly diminished, if Americans feel like they are getting poorer rapidly, and there's no way out of it, that they are being sucked into an economic black hole, that I think would be sufficient. I don't think that people have to starve, literally. And so what would happen in this case? What would it look like? Would there be people out in the streets, flipping over cars and burning buildings down, in some, like on what is it, the Washington Mall? I guess that'd be the closest thing we have to like a Maidan Square or a Tahrir Square or a, gosh, where do they do it in Paris? But, you've seen it on TV plenty of times. You get a group of, some people in the town square of, the main square of the capital city, and they say, you got to resign now. And then, the dictator or the fairly elected president, whoever it may be, says, oh, shucks, I got to leave. I guess I'll hop on this plane with a few duffel bags full of cash, and I'll go live in Switzerland or the UAE or Monaco. Well, we wouldn't see something like that in the U.S. That's what you see in a true revolution. In a revolution, it's a little different than a collapse. A revolution occurs not when there's an incongruence between the structure of the state and society, but rather when people are just discontent with their leaders. When people don't have any real gripes, about the society itself, when the society is, somewhat unified, or at least there's an idea to unify around, that's when they overthrow the existing government and just, put new people in, basically. I don't see that ever happening in the United States. It would be it'd be rather fantastical, I think. The idea of, Americans going on the Washington Mall and, yelling at the president to resign, and then he resigns, and, somebody new comes in, and that's what we would call our Great Revolution. No, Americans understand that it doesn't really matter who's president. It is a corrupt system from top to bottom. What would happen in this country if we get to a breaking point, which I think our leaders are pushing us closer to every year, and are, with this China stuff, are threatening to push us over the edge, what we would see is a disregard for federal authority and therefore an erosion of their power. Governments have power so long as people follow their orders. And once people just stop following their orders, governments very quickly, fade into the mists of history. Look at the German Democratic Republic. East Germany existed for over 40 years, or right around 40 years. I think it was 41 years old, because it was like 1948, or was it 49? Maybe it was 1949, so it was exactly 40 years old. And one day, the wall came down and East Germany was no more. How did that happen? People were under the impression, from the news, it's a long story, I won't get too much into it, but basically it was messaging. It was a PR mistake on the part of the East German government. They communicated to the public that they were allowed to cross into West Berlin and go shopping. That apparently was not true. That was not like an official, order that had been handed down from the Central Committee or from the General Secretary's office. But nevertheless, people got that message. They rushed to the border checkpoints in East Berlin and, told the border guards, hey, they just said on TV we're allowed to go over to the West and go shopping. And one of those guards, of course there were many of them, but one of them finally at first said, you know what, I guess if there's that many people there, they're saying they're allowed to go through, I guess we can let them through. And when he did that, the East German government, their fate was sealed. They were gone. East Germany evaporated overnight. The wall was down. It was, the dam had broken. And there wasn't any violence. There wasn't really anything that fundamentally changed. It was just a change in mindset. People had a mindset. The government says we're not allowed to cross this line, so we can't cross this line. We live here in East Germany. We're East Germans. And then all of a sudden, they got it in their head, this idea that we're allowed to cross the line. And as soon as they did, there was no more East Germany. It's how quickly these things can happen. If you think about the number of people who work enforcing the edicts of the federal government, they number quite small. And more importantly, these are people who add nothing to our daily lives. These are all 100% non-essential workers. There is not a single job in the U.S. federal government that needs to exist. All of the, even if you're not some crazy anti-government person like me, all of the role of a normal, state that the average person, would think is fair and just, all of those roles are filled by the state governments. Federal employees are completely redundant. And so the way things will happen here in the U.S. is that states will merely choose to go their separate ways. They will stop respecting federal edicts, which apply across all 50 states, and they will make their own rules. They will govern themselves differently. They will eventually, in the final stages, start to have their own foreign policy. What I'm getting at here is not that the state governments are wonderful and they're magical and they're great and perfect, and the federal government is terrible, awful, and evil. It's that the federal government is disposable. The state government's less so. The federal government is increasingly intolerable. The state governments are oftentimes tolerable for their citizens. People in the U.S., as it currently stands, can choose to live in any of the 50 states. Most people, if they choose to ever move between states, will pick the state that they want to live in the most, the state that they think, oftentimes is governed the best. Moreover, the state and local governments, and remember the local governments are structurally, beneath the state. They are subservient to the state. They are created by the state, unlike the states themselves, which precede the federal government. The roles filled by the state government are generally, by most people, considered to be more essential. Policing, schooling, general laws. We don't normally talk too much about federal law except in extraordinary circumstances. For the most part, going about our daily lives, we deal with state law. And so people already, I've established, don't like the federal government. And if the federal government brings about a dramatic plunge in living standards and drive people into abject poverty, it becomes rather easy for people to simply disassociate from the federal government, especially if the federal government itself is bankrupt at that point, because they have the state governments to fall back on. They don't need to overthrow the federal government and replace it with something else, even if they think there should be some kind of government. They already have their own governments. We have 50 governments here in the United States. The federal government is superfluous. It's been trying to amalgamate, or that's the wrong term. I didn't sleep well last night, so excuse me if I keep using the wrong word constantly. The federal government's trying to assume the duties that traditionally have fallen to the state themselves. And in doing so, they create friction with the citizens who think that the federal government is doing a worse job than the states, while at the same time, not adding any value, because this was something that was already being done in many cases, in the opinions of many citizens, being done better by the state governments. All that has kept the federal government going is inertia. If we were starting from scratch today, there would not be, this federal government that we have now would not be created. No one would choose to have it. And that's how you know that a government is fragile. If a government is around today because it existed yesterday, rather than because it is considered necessary by people in the present day, then its days are numbered. I think that the example of Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War are really the best analogies to the current America. When you have the collapse of a state within that is a federation, you don't have a simple regime change. It's not like going from the Second Empire to the Third Republic in France. It's not like going from the pre-Maidan government in Ukraine to the post-Maidan government. Once the U.S. is broken, it will not be put back together again the same way. Every election, the hopes of one side or the other in our political spectrum are dashed. They become more cynical. No matter who wins, no matter who loses, half of the country becomes more bitter. And even if it's their time to win this time, the next time they'll be the ones who become embittered. And the more and more this drags on, the more people resent the federal state. And so in threatening these sanctions, the United States hopes to bring about the collapse and the dissolution of modern China. But I think that they're much more likely to bring about the dissolution and collapse of our own country. The people running our government have no concept of their own mortality. I've said this before, that they think that their powers are limitless. And when you have essentially no sense of pain, you're going to do things that hurt you. And this is what happens when you have old empires, where people become arrogant. And they have, there is no more, they feel like they've already reached the peak. They're not struggling to get higher. They're not trying to advance the power of the state. They think that they've reached the apex. They are capable of world domination if they so will it, because, goddamn it, they control the United States government. And I don't think enough people recognize that, just how fragile we are. Like I say all the time, 5% on the 10-year, that's all it would take. We'd be over, and nobody would put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We only exist now because of King Dollar, and they're doing everything they can with the sanctions to make the dollar irrelevant. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.